Joining me now to discuss religious freedom issues is Utah Senator Mike Lee. Senator Lee, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
Senator Lee, talk to me about this new possible bill that you passed, the Marriage and Religious Freedom Act. What would this do if it were passed? What would it seek to do? Please explain it for the folks at home.
Okay, the easiest way I can explain it, the most fundamental purpose of this bill is to protect religious institutions in their belief as to the sanctity of marriage as an institution between one man and one woman. It would make it impossible for the federal government to discriminate against such churches or against similarly situated organizations based on the belief and action taken in conformity with the belief that marriage exists between one man and one woman. A church, in other words, should not have to make a decision between, on the one hand, putting its tax-exempt status at risk, and on the other hand, either maintaining or continuing to adhere to, as opposed to abandoning, its own religious beliefs relative to marriage.
So this would essentially create a federal statute that would try to protect institutions from having to act outside of their religious beliefs, and it would protect their tax-exempt status. It would protect them, I assume, from lawsuits as well. We saw in Denver this very famous case of somebody who refused to bake a cake for a gay wedding and was told by the judge in that instance they, in fact, in the future could not refuse, and the proprietor of that bakery said that he'd rather shut down his shop. So this has obviously become a major cause, a major issue across the country. But I wanted to ask you, how would this be more effective in your view than, say, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which certainly now has come under assault in different ways from the Obama administration? It seems like even straightforward black-letter law is no impediment to President Obama's progressive agenda.
Yeah, it's one of the many reasons why we think it's important to drill down on this specific issue. I think on this issue, the overwhelming majority of Americans would agree that the government should have no say in what an individual or what a church might believe regarding the sanctity of marriage. This is a decision to be made without the influence of government, particularly without the influence of the federal government. And so that's what we're trying to do here, is to keep the federal government at bay and out of that decision-making process. And here, since there is a significant degree of consensus among the American people on this issue, we think it's important to drill down on this issue specifically and cabin this out as an area that's outside the federal government's power.
Do you believe that at this point, even though obviously the DOMA decision didn't go the way that many proponents of traditional marriage had hoped for, had planned, do you think that these sorts of laws now are able to survive scrutiny in the courts? It seems like there is a tide right now, a rising tide of a judicial activism that tries to essentially gut any attempts to protect conscience, to protect freedom of religion. The First Amendment is now becoming almost a punchline to a lot of those on the left who view it as essentially only a tool to berate their opponents, but never allow them to actually act on their own conscience. So how do you see that playing out in terms of the way the courts will view this? I mean, do you think that we can actually trust judges, even if this law that you're proposing were passed, not to essentially just by judicial fiat from the bench get rid of it?
I think it would survive, and I think under the case law in effect today, it would stand on very firm ground. Among other precedents that we could point to, I would point to a decision rendered by the Supreme Court of the United States in 1987 called Corporation of the Presiding Bishop versus Amos, which upheld the validity of a carve-out for religious institutions in the context of employment law. And here, I think this would stand on similarly solid constitutional ground. But again, it's important that we continue to legislate in this area, making clear that this is something that as a country we value, making clear that our members of Congress stand behind the American people and saying, let's keep the federal government out of church. Let's keep the federal government and religion separated, especially to the extent necessary to protect religious beliefs from undue interference by the federal government.
What are your expectations for the Supreme Court when it's taking up some of the cases that challenge Obamacare's intrusion into rights of conscience, religious freedom? Do you think that Hobby Lobby, some of these other cases that are coming up, making their way through the courts, I know the Supreme Court is taking on at least one of them, is going to show finally that there are limits to what the federal government can make you do that would violate one's conscience, that would in fact very clearly infringe upon religious rights and freedom? I mean, are you hopeful for that, or do you think that we're just going to have to keep on chipping away and trying to win the argument?
Yes, look, it's always difficult to predict what the Supreme Court will do. But I will say that if the Supreme Court follows the law, if the Supreme Court follows the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and if it follows its other religious freedom jurisprudence, then the Supreme Court will likely conclude that these provisions, these regulations, do cause a problem that can't be justified under the current legislative and constitutional framework. But nothing is certain these days, and we've got a few relatively new members of the court that make this issue a little bit difficult to predict.
Understandably so. Now, Governor Bobby Jindal of Louisiana has come out and weighed in upon the issue du jour, of course, this Duck Dynasty furor over the comments he made to GQ magazine. What's your take on the sort of state of the political correctness run amok right now in this country? Is there anything you want to say about what happened with the Duck Dynasty, or just more broadly about how in this country it seems that we are willing to only allow speech that seems to be acceptable to one side of the ideological spectrum?
Well, I will say this. What I think almost all Americans can agree on is that as situations like that one make clear, not everyone is going to agree all the time on everything, but we need to keep the government, especially the federal government, out of the way. The federal government has no business telling someone that they can't express their viewpoint on this issue or on that issue. And the federal government generally has no business telling an employer whether or not to make an adjustment with an employee based on that employee's decision to utter the words of his or her choice. The idea is to keep the federal government out of our decisions with respect to our own free speech. And it's just as important to keep the federal government out of our decisions in the religious realm. The federal government has no business telling us when, whether, how, where, or what to worship. And it also has no business telling us what to say or not say. Well,
certainly this administration has tested out all those theories, is pushing pretty hard against the notion that people should have rights of conscience. They seem to be very aggressively, particularly through HHS, trying to deny people the right to live their religion in any meaningful context. They want to dictate from D.C. just what's happening there. Senator Mike Lee from Utah, Merry Christmas to you and your family, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Merry Christmas to you also. Thank you.